So today's video is going to be about how to create this laser cutting effect where we've got a laser kind of cutting into metal and there's sparks flying out, and there's also a bit of a glow that's following the laser around as if the metal is getting heated up. The techniques we're going to be looking at today are how to use multiple dynamic paint layers to create several effects, how to get a single object to follow multiple curve paths. We'll also spend a bit of time looking at optimizations for the cycles renderer so we can get some really quick rendering going on. And then we're going to bring all our layers together in the compositor and do a bit of compositing. So the first thing I want to do is explain why we're using cycles for this. And basically the internal renderer that Blender uses is going to be discontinued at some point. And so it's important to start to learn how to use cycles in a similar way to how we used internal. And by that I mean creating non-photorealistic renders in a fairly quick render time. And so I don't want people to be put off from doing this tutorial because it's in cycles and you may have a low-end GPU or you may not even have a GPU. And so we're really going to be focusing on making a really quick render by doing lots of optimizations. So anyway, what I've got here is my pre-made curve, and this is the object that we're going to be drawing into the metal with the laser. And because we're only going to be using the curve as a path and we're not going to be rendering it, I'm going to set its display mode to be wire. I'm then going to set the origin to geometry, just so it centers it. And the next thing we're going to do is create an object that's actually going to travel around this path. And so I'm going to do Shift A, add mesh, UV sphere, set it to smooth shading, and when it's travelling around this path it's going to be drawing a line behind it, creating a trail which is going to be used as a texture later on. And so if we have the sphere really big, it's going to draw a massive line. We're not going to see any of the smaller details, and if it's too small we might not be able to see the line, so we just want it to be a reasonable size. And so the next thing to do is to get it to travel around the curve. And to do that, we'll be using the follow path constraint. So we'll choose our curve, and you can see that our sphere has jumped onto the curve. And if I go on the curve data property, we can alter this evaluation time option under the path animation heading, and we can see our sphere moves around. But it doesn't move around this part of the curve, and that's because really this needs to be a separate curve. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, select one of the points and press L, and that selects everything connected to it, and then press P and it separates it from the rest of the curve. So now we've got a separate curve. So what I'm then going to do is add a second follow path constraint, and this will be for the second path. So I'll select our second one, and our sphere has jumped off into the distance somewhere, and that's because you can't really have two follow path constraints on at the same time. So if I turn this one off, we can see it is actually working, and again, changing this evaluation time option, we see it travels round. But now we have the problem of how do we get them working at the same time, and we'll be focusing on that a bit later on. The thing we're going to do next is create the actual laser beam which has to follow this sphere as it moves around. So making sure in top view, I'm going to Shift A, add a cube, and then I'm going to press S. I'm then going to press Shift Z, and if you look in the corner just here it says locking global Z, which means it's scaling down but not in the Z axis. And if we look at it, it's remained as tall as it should be. So I'm then going to scale it up on the Z even more, and we're just creating a beam that's going to act as our beam of light. And I'm then going to move it up, and then we're going to move our origin up to the top because it needs to pivot around the top as it points to the sphere. Shift S, cursor selected, and then object mode, origin to 3D cursor. And we're then going to use a constraint to make it point or stretch towards the sphere. And the constraint is the stretch to constraint. So we're going to choose our sphere, and it's done something, but it's gone off at a weird angle. And to fix this, we're going to go into edit mode, select everything, turn off the constraint for a second, and rotating around the 3D cursor, we're going to press R and then -90. And then tabbing out of edit mode and re-enabling the stretch, we can see it's working, although it's working a bit too well. So tabbing into edit mode, I'm just going to box select around those vertices, and then moving on the local y-axis by pressing G and then Y twice, I'm just going to move the vertices up to be in the sphere. And if I then change that animation value, we can see our laser beam is following. And so what we can then do is get this to properly animate. So selecting the sphere, I'm going to re-enable this first follow path constraint. Then on the path properties, we're on frame 1. And I want this number to be frame 18, or number 18. And 18 is just the position on the curve. So it's effectively 18% of the way round. And then I'm going to press I to keyframe it. And then on frame 176, and I know this seems like a bit of a random number, but it kind of makes sense with the rest of the timings I've got set up. We're going to set it to be 118. And that's because we've said it's going to take 100 frames to complete. We started on frame 18, so plus 100, it'll end on frame 118. So press I. And if we scroll through, we can see it's done one complete circuit of the text. So now we need to do the same for the second one. So selecting the sphere, I'm going to swap to the second constraint, and then on frame 194, and then selecting the curve, I'm going to set this to 0, so it's 0% away round the curve, and press I to set a keyframe. And then on frame 230, it's going to be 100% round, and then I. So you can see it goes round. And if I select both these curves, you can see there's an actual gap between where this one ends and this one starts. And that's because there's going to be a pause where the laser beam disappears, almost as if it has to move its position before it can start burning the second part of the curve. But we're still not animating them both at the same time. So to do that, we need to actually animate the influence, this influence here, that the constraint has. So on frame 177, which is the frame after, if I just turn this off, is just after this sphere finishes going round this part of the curve. So on frame 177, I'm going to animate the influence of this one to be 1, and on the next frame, it's going to be 0. And so it's jumped to the second curve. But I don't actually want it to go there yet, because I want it to pause. So I'm going to set this to be 0, and it's jumped to the middle. And then on frame 192, which is 2 frames before this second curve starts animating, I'm going to animate this to be off, and then on the next frame, it's going to be on. So just to recap, it finishes going around this curve, and this constraint will turn off, and it jumps to the middle, which is its default position. There's a pause while the laser moves, and then the second constraint turns on, and it continues round. So now that we've animated it round, we can now get it to start drawing that line I spoke about. So it's going to draw a black line, and it needs something to draw on, so I'm going to add a plane, and we're going to scale it up so the text just fits inside, and then we're going to use dynamic paint. And if you haven't used that before, it allows one object to paint onto another object. And you can see we've got the option of canvas and brush, and this is going to be our canvas because the sphere is going to draw onto this plane. So we'll add canvas, and instead of a vertex, we want it to generate an image sequence because we're going to be using that as a texture later on. We want the substeps to be 5, and the substeps just smooths out the stroke by adding pretend frames in between. We want it to paint, and we want it to dry, but if I just expand this out a bit, we don't want it to slow dry, we want it to dry in 15 frames because it's going to create that trail behind it. And we're actually going to rename this as trail because we're going to have another layer later on. We also then need to set a UV map it's going to use, so I'm going to tab into edit mode, U, projection view bounds, and we can then choose that UV map here. We're then going to set a directory that it's going to put all these images it generates into. So I'll create a new directory called dynamic laser trail and accept that. And because we've set it to dry, we're not using a paint map, we're using a wet map. And then I'm going to rename this laser trail ###.png, and the hashes represent the frame number, which Blender will then replace those hashes with. And then we're also going to set it to shrink, so that it almost looks like the glowing metal behind the laser is cooling down and the glow is contracting. So we're going to use shrink, and we're going to enable it. And that's all we have to set up for the canvas. We just need to set up the brush now. So dynamic paint, brush this time, add brush, and we're just going to set it to be completely black, so it's painting black onto our canvas. And what this is going to do is generate a whole folder of images, one for each frame, of where the sphere touches the canvas, this plane, and it's going to draw a line. But before we press bake, one thing I've got to make sure is that it's actually going to touch this plane, and at the minute it's not because it's right above it, so I'll press 0. And now we're making sure that it's going to interact with our brush. So I'm going to press save, and then we're going to bake. So I'm then going to quickly set up a texture, and although I said we were going to use the internal render for this effect, I'm going to very quickly set up an internal texture, just so we can see what's going on. And again, you don't need to do this, I'm just showing you so we can see the effect. So it's going to be an image, and then it's going to be an image sequence. We've got 250 frames. We want it to auto refresh, and we're going to use the UV mapping we set up. You can already see the start of the effect. We're going to go into texture mode, and then tapping into edit mode, I'll load up the UV image editor. And then we also have to load the image in here so we can see it in the viewport. But now it's loading the texture. And so if I scroll through, you can see that trail appearing behind it just as we want. And then it goes on to the second part. But you may have noticed a problem, and that's these dots that are appearing. And so what we need to do is actually turn the dynamic paint on and off by animating a few of the values. So that's what we're going to do next. So over on the dynamic paint, I'm going to go to frame 177, and that's the frame just before the dynamic paint should turn off. So just before it jumps to the middle. And I'm going to animate the scale and the substeps. So they're on at the minute, and I've just pressed I over those values to keyframe them. Go to the next frame, and they should be off. So we'll set them to 0 and keyframe them. I'm then going to go to frame 192, and this is a couple of frames before they should turn on again. And so we're going to keyframe this so it remains at a constant 0 in this gap. And then on the next frame, it should turn back on. But you'll notice I didn't keyframe substeps, and just to make sure they don't come on before we want them to, we're going to animate them turning on a frame later than we animate the influence. So I know we didn't do that when we were turning them off, but it's just a problem that seems to crop up when we're turning them back on. So the influence is off and then on, and it's on this frame that we're going to set this to be 0 again, so it's constant in this gap. And then the next frame, we turn it back up to 5. So it's just happening a frame later. So it's going round, turning off, and then turning back on. And we could bake out the images again to correct this, but there's actually a few more places we need to animate the influence on before it's fully correct. So on frame 230, I'm also going to put a keyframe for the influence. And on 240, I'm going to set it to be 0 and keyframe that. And that's just so we get a bit of a fade out at the end. And it should fade anyway, but I just found that it wasn't always fading correctly. So just at the end, to make sure it goes off, I'm keyframing that influence again. And I'm going to do the same at the beginning, except I'm just going to do it over a period of 1 frame. So it should be off, and this is because we're going to have 1 frame gap before the animation starts. So it's off, and then on the next frame it starts up again, so it's going to be 1. And so now we've done most of the animating we need to do, I'm going to rebake that image sequence. So I'm going to save, and then bake. So now that that's finished, I'm going to reload the texture so we can see the new effect. And if I scroll through, we can see the effect we were getting before, and it turns off, and then it turns back on without any problem, and then it fades out at the end. So we've now successfully animated our dynamic paint to work correctly. But the next thing we need to do is create our second dynamic paint layer. So we've created the trail, and now we need to create the solid line that this ball will also draw at the same time. So I'm going to click the plus icon, change it to image sequence, and this is going to be the solid line, and all the settings can stay the same, apart from the fact that we're not going to dry and we're actually not going to shrink, but it's already turned that off. We're also going to have an initial colour this time of white. We're going to use the UV map, and then we're going to choose a new directory. So I'm going to create a new directory, and this will be Dynamic Laser Solid. So we'll choose that. And this time, because we're not using dry, we are going to use the paint map. So I'm going to name this Laser Solid ###.png. But now all we need to do is match the same keyframes as we have on the other layer. We need to animate the influence and the subframes again. So going back to frame 1, and I'm going quite quickly because we're just matching it up to the previous keyframes. And then we'll save. And that should be all we need to do. And now we can bake out our second set of images. So that's finished now. And I'm just going to load up the texture so we can see the effects. And I'm going to replace it because we're using a different image this time. We're using the solid instead of the trail. And we're using an image sequence. I'll go into edit mode and then the UV image editor and change the image to solid. And we'll just go out of edit mode, press back. And here we can see our solid line being drawn. And so basically that's the dynamic paint part of the tutorial over. All I would suggest doing is at this point, and before we move on to the other parts, you should now up the resolution, probably up to maybe 1024. So that'll be 1000 pixels across, and it'll obviously take a lot longer to bake, but if you're doing a close-up you will want a higher resolution. I'm just going to leave it lower because for the tutorial it doesn't really matter. And one thing we're going to quickly do is animate the visibility of our laser objects. So I'm just going to go into solid mode and bring down the outliner, and selecting our laser ball and our laser beam, I'm going to go to the first frame, and this is where they should be invisible. So I'm going to disable their visibility in the viewport and keyframe that with I, and do that for both of them. And I'm also going to do the same with the render, so they also don't appear when rendered. I'm then going to go to the next frame and make sure they're visible and keyframe that. And then going up to the frame just before dynamic paint turns off, I'm going to keyframe them again to make sure they stay on during that period. And then on the next frame they should be invisible. And then on this frame I'm also going to keyframe it so they'll be solidly off during that period. And then on the next frame they're visible again. And then finally, on frame 230, they should also turn off because that is the end of the animation. So now if we scroll through, they're off, they turn on, they turn off, and on again, and then off. And now we're going to use that texture we created a minute ago. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to Shift D and duplicate this plane, and I'm going to press M and then 0 to move it to layer 10. And I'm just creating a backup really, because at this point we're going to start subdividing this before we displace it. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and we're going to start subdividing. So press W, and then if you press F6 we bring up the panel. I'll just take that up, and then we're going to carry on. And you will want to be a bit careful about this. Make sure you save if you've got a slow computer, because it will crash at some point if you do too many. But we're going to go pretty high, so we'll probably go one further. And you can see it's taking a bit of time. Tab out of edit mode, and now what we're going to do is add a displace modifier. We're going to do a new texture, and you can already see the effect. It's created a noise texture. Now's the point that we need to change to cycles. We'll change the clouds to be an image, and we will open our solid image sequence, and it already knows it's an image sequence, but we've got 250 frames. We're going to turn on auto refresh, and you can already see the effects in the viewport, although it is a bit extreme at the minute. We'll change it to UV, although it does already seem to have used the UV, and then we'll just start lowering the strength a bit. So let's try 0.05, and actually that's probably alright. We'll then press space, and I'll just type shade and then smooth, but you can still see it's a bit jagged, so we're then going to add a smooth modifier, and I'm going to change this to be 1.5. That's the smoothing factor, and then we're going to repeat this 4 times. And I'm going to turn off X and Y, because it's only in the Z that we need to smooth, and you can see the effect of it. And so, although we probably can't play this in real time because it's a bit too high res for that, we can click in different parts of the timeline and see that our dynamic paint is driving this displacement because we're using an image sequence. So the next thing I'm going to do is start kind of organising our layers a bit better. So on layer 1 we're going to have this plane. On layer 2 we're going to have the laser beam. On layer 3 we're going to have the laser ball. On layer 3 I'm going to shift D and then move a copy of the ball to layer 4. And then on layer 4, so now we've got layer 3 and 4 are practically identical at the minute, I'm going to remove the dynamic paint off this ball. And that's because it's time to set up those sparks that are appearing in my render. And we do that by emitting from this ball. Now you may think, why am I just not emitting the particles from the other ball? And that's basically because we need to separate the ball and the sparks in the compositor. And so this ball actually won't render, and only the sparks emitted from it will. And on the other layer, the ball will render, so then we can put them back together in the compositor. So the next thing to do is to add a particle system. So I'm going to change the amount to be 4000, and we're going to end at frame 250, but they're only going to have a lifetime of 1 frame. So almost as soon as they appear, they will then disappear. We'll then change the emission to be random. They're not going to go anywhere, so that can have 0 normal, so they won't fly out, they'll just stay wherever they appear. We'll then enable rotation, and this will be normal, but we'll put the random all the way up to 1. We're then going to have a random size of 0.5, and I'm then going to turn off the emitter, because like I said, we don't want the ball rendering, we just want the particles from it. And then what particle are we going to be emitting? Well, we're going to be emitting an object, but we haven't yet created the object, so we'll do that next. So in top view, I'm just going to Shift A, add a cube, and like we did before, I'm going to press S and then Shift Z, so it doesn't scale on the Z. And then going to press Ctrl 2, and it's a nice little shortcut, just to add a subsurf modifier. And what we've got here is the beginnings of our spark. So I'm going to shade smooth. So I'm just going to press Ctrl R, scroll up the mouse wheel to add in 2 loops, and then I'm just going to press S and then Z to scale up a bit. And there we've got our spark. And so all I'm going to do now is quickly add a material, and I'll set this to be an emission and orange, and then I'll just set this to be 10 for the minute. Then back to our particle system, just remembering the name, which is cube 001. We can now choose it from here. And one thing we've got to do is change the origin point. So just going into wireframe mode, Shift S, cursor selected, and then origin to 3D cursor. And then I'll just increase the size of the particles. And now if I go back and then press Alt A, we can now see we've got some kind of sparks going on. Now this was the duplicated ball, and now very quickly I'm going to duplicate our laser beam and create a slightly shorter one. So I'm going to press Shift D and then move it to layer 5. And we're just going to use this object in the compositor. So it's just going to have a very basic material. So I'm going to press New, and we're just going to leave it at white, because we're basically just going to use it as a mask of where to add a bit of an extra glow. So I'm going to go into edit mode, select everything, and Shift D, and then S and Y. And then we'll bring this area out a bit. And although it may not be clear what this is actually creating, what it's going to do is just give an extra glow along the laser beam a bit later on. So I'll add a loop cut in there and in there. And I'm just leaving this original beam in there for the moment, just to use as a reference for size. But now we can delete it, so I'll just select a vertex, press L, and then delete vertices. And then in object mode, I'm just going to press Ctrl 2 to add a subsurf modifier. And that should do for the minute. And if I turn the constraint back on, because I turned it off in edit to edit it, and then we'll turn on our original one, I can see that maybe the size is going to be a bit too much. So I'm just going to select everything, and then S, Y, Y. So we're scaling on the Y axis. And I'll set it to smooth shading. And then the only other options, because this is only going to be used in the compositor, we don't need it to be visible to anything else apart from the camera, so we don't want it to appear in the shadows or reflections. And the next thing to do is set up some materials. So the first one I'll do is the world material, so just use nodes, we'll set it to white, and then 0.1, because we don't need to be too strong. And then we'll go back to layer 1, and we'll start working on the main material. And one thing I'm going to do is just move the camera a bit closer, with just G and then ZZ, to move along the local Z axis, so we can move in a bit. And then what I'm going to do is extend this plane out so it fills the whole camera view. Now if we'd done that earlier, then we would have had a whole lot of subdivisions that we didn't need, because obviously only this central part of the plane needs to have high subdivisions so it can be displaced. The edges, which will extend now, don't need to have any subdivisions. So I'm just going to go in and edge by edge, I'm going to press Alt, then right click, and then back to camera view, GYY, and we're going to extend it out, and then I'm just going to repeat that for all the other edges. Now I can see there's a slight problem, and that's because when we did the dynamic paint, it probably went a bit too close to the edge, and so we're getting stretching off here. So what I'm going to do is actually separate out these edges we just extended. So I just alt clicked, and then shift alt click, and then P, and then selection, and then I'm just going to remove the displacement. And obviously it's moved it down a bit. I'm actually going to turn on snapping, and then GZ to move it up and down. I'm just going to hold Control and snap to this corner vertex. And so the next thing we're going to do is focus on the main material that creates the whole effect. Over to the node editor, I want use nodes, and what we're going to be doing is mixing between a diffuse shader and an emission shader. And this emission shader is going to be that orange trail. And then we're going to use one of our image sequences, so texture, image texture, and we're going to be using the trail as a mask of where to mix between these two shaders. So shader, mix shader. And then we will use the colour in the factor. We want 250 frames. We want auto refresh. And we want non-colour data. And that's because we're using it as a factor. And you can see this little dot here is grey. And that means it's expecting data. So we don't want to use RGB colour data. And then I'm just going to put in some texture coordinates. So it knows to use the UVs. And then I'm going to put this up to 10. And so if we switch back to the 3D view and change to rendered, and I'm just going to turn off the displacement just to hopefully make things a bit quicker. And so you can see we're getting this orange trail. And you can see that our central canvas has actually moved down, and that's just because we've turned the displace off temporarily. So if I just drag out a new window so we can have the nodes in here, and if I just change to rendered view, and then if I press Shift B, that means we can render that bit only, and so that saves a bit of render time, makes it a bit quicker and a bit more responsive. So I'll just minimize that, and we're actually going to have another mix shader instead of just a simple diffuse. So I'm going to move this back a bit, duplicate the mix, and this time we're going to be using the solid dynamic paint images as a factor for this mix shader. So I can duplicate this with Shift D, and I will just change to solid for a second, and we will open the solid image sequence and minimize that, tell it to be UV, change it there, and then plug a second diffuse in, and we'll make this one a bit darker. And if we then render, and actually I'll just swap these around, what we can see is that the part of the mesh that will be displaced downwards is a bit darker, because that's kind of where it's been burnt by the laser, and so it shouldn't be as bright as the rest of the mesh. And instead of having just a plain diffuse, we're actually going to bring in an HDR image. So texture, image texture, open, and I'm going to use this one I've pre-prepared, which is a blurred HDR image, and I'm going to map that into the colour, and we're going to use the mapping of reflection. And actually, because I know these settings quite well, I'm also going to bring in a vector mapping node, and I know from the experience of the time I've done this, I just need to scale this down a bit. So if we expand this area, and I think the error that we're getting with all this weird kind of lines going across it is the curve still being rendered. So I'll go into solid view, and selecting our curves, I'll then move them to layer 9. And if we go back to rendered view, and although it looks plain, even though we've matched HDR, what we'll find is that once we reapply the displace, we'll see a lot of highlights and fake reflections. And by mapping an image onto the reflection, it saves us having to do kind of the cycles reflection, which obviously take a long time to render. So this is obviously a lot quicker. So if I just turn the displace back on, you can see we're getting these really nice highlights of the fake reflection. And you can see we're getting a few jagged edges, and I expect that's because I didn't rebake my images at a high resolution. So that's most of the main material done now, and we'll move on to some of the other materials that we need. So I'll go back to solid mode, and on layer 2 we need to now create a red laser. So I'll just name this red laser, and we'll change it to a red colour, and I'll copy that into the viewport with just Control C and Control V, and we'll change this to an emission, and this will be 10. So then I'll go on to layer 3, and this little ball will also use red laser. The sparks already have a material, and then this just has a plain diffuse. So if I enable all the layers at once, and I will just move this particle onto layer 8, and I'll go into camera view and change to rendered again. And you can see that red emission is actually casting light on, which is why it's got so speckly, because we're not really doing enough samples. But again, that's something we'll see in the full render. And I can just expand this out now, so I'll set it to solid, expand it out, and to get this border I press Ctrl B, and that's border render. If you want to get rid of this, it's Ctrl Alt B, and that just clears it. So now we'll get the full render again, and I'll just move along in the timeline to somewhere where we've got a bit more of the text visible, and we'll have a look at how it's looking. So we can see that we've got the red casting the light, and we've got the sparks appearing, but obviously it still needs a lot more samples when it gets rendered in the final version. And what we need to do now, before we do the final render and compositing, is not only do some optimizations, but we also need to set up the render layers. So we'll do the render layers first, go down to layers, we've got our main render layer here, and this is just going to be layer 1, because we only want it to render this first plane. And the only thing that's going to be different on this one is that we also want a normal pass, and that's to do with one of the techniques we're going to use to remove some noise in the compositor. The next render layer is going to be layer 2, and this is going to be red laser. And we're going to mask this layer by layer 1, and that's just in case that long laser beam intersects the plane, and so we want it to be cut off by the first layer. And we don't want the environment to render, because we don't want the background to be visible. And what you can see here is a samples number, and if you're familiar with the sampling of cycles, you'll know that when we increase the number of samples, the quality of the render increases. And what we've got here is a control that will override the overall samples. And what that means is you can give each layer a different number of render samples. So more complex layers can have more render samples, and simpler render layers can have next to no samples. And it's really a good way of optimizing your render, because not everything will need the maximum amount of samples. So we're going to give red laser only 5 samples, but this one, staying at 0, will just use the default 10. And we'll actually change that later anyway. So anyway, we'll do another render layer, and this will be laser ball, and this will be layer 3, and again we'll have 5 samples, and we don't want the environment. The next one we're going to do is the sparks render layer, and this is layer 4, I think, and this will actually need a few more, so it needs 20, and we're also going to have the environment rendering in this one, and that's just to do with the way it gets combined later on. And then our last render layer, and this is that glow mask, that slightly odd shaped object that we made, and this is on layer 5. It's going to have 10 samples, and it's also going to have the environment. And that's how render layers set up. So in the compositor, even though they'll all render as one image, we'll actually be able to apply different effects to different parts. So the laser will have a glow, whereas the main layer won't. Now, I spoke about optimizations, so we'll move up to sampling. And overall, I think I had only 50 samples, but again, I said we were going to use some techniques in the compositor to remove the noise, so that's how we can render such a low amount. And then under light paths, this is where we really reduce the amount of samples. So on transparency, I'm going to set it to 0 and 0, because we don't need any transparency. I'm going to put bounces to 1 and 1, and put diffuse to 0, 1 for glossy, and only 1 for transmission. We don't need any shadows, and we don't need any caustics. So if you've used cycles at all, you'll know these are really, really low samples, but that's really what brings the speed up for the render. And I heard something a while ago about cycles, I can't remember who said it, but they basically said that for the internal renderer, generally to get things to look good, you have to turn lots of settings on. But with cycles, it's the opposite, and you have to turn lots of settings off to get a quick, basic render. And so that's what we're doing. We're really taking it to the minimum of what we need to give that really good speed. Another thing to look at in performance is using a static BVH, which I don't know how it works, but it basically says it'll render a bit faster, and we'll also cache it. So now we're pretty much ready to render. And so what I'm going to do is just make sure we enable all our layers. So now we're ready to render. So I'm just going to save, and then we'll render. And there's one thing I forgot to do, and it's why we haven't got a transparent background here, and that's to set it to render transparent under the film options. So I'm just going to give it another render, and then we should be good to go. And so we can now go into the compositor and over to the compositing nodes. We want to use nodes, and we're going to enable the backdrop. And the first thing we're going to do is add an output viewer so we can actually see what we're doing. And one of the very first things we're going to do is sort out this noise and get rid of it. And this isn't something that I've come up with, it's something that I saw in the Blender wiki. And what we're going to do is add an add node, so color mix, and then we'll change it to add. And we're going to drop in the Z into the bottom part, into the top one, and then we're going to add a filter bilateral blur. And we're going to drop that in and connect it. And you can see what it's done is basically just blur everything. But what you'll also see is that we've got this thing called the determinator. And that's what we're going to plug this add node into. And so if I just drag it in, we can see it's pretty much completely removed all of the noise. And what it's done very cleverly, and I'm really not sure how it kind of does this, but it's combined the Z pass and the normal pass, and it's used that as a mask of where to blur. So it's intelligently blurring, and it's actually removed all the noise. Now you can alter these values. Different values in here will give different amounts of blur. So if I put that down to 0.1, you can see that's actually a lot better, and it brings it back a lot of the highlights. But we're also starting to get this kind of speckling, and that's a result of the blur. So we might actually want to put that up a bit. And obviously, if you want a really high quality result, you probably would want to put the samples up. But just for speed, this really works. And now we can move on to combining in the other layers. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this render layer node, and I'm going to change it to be our red laser. And I'm also then going to duplicate our add node and drop it in there. And I'm then going to plug in our red laser into the bottom part. And so now you see we've got the laser on top. And what I'm also going to do is duplicate this and change it to our laser ball and duplicate our add node, and then we will add these two together. Going back to our red laser layer, I'm going to add yet another add node, and what we're going to do is add a blurred version of the layer onto a non-blurred version. So I'll plug both of the inputs into the same one. So I'm going to Shift A, add filter blur, and plug that into the bottom input. And this is going to be a 1.5 and 1.5. And I'm actually going to turn on relative, so we'll have to do that again. And relative just means that even if we increase the image size, the blur will stay the correct size in proportion to the image. We'll then change it to 0.2, so we can now bring back some of the original laser. And then we're just going to add in a color, hue and saturation node into the top input, and we're going to take the saturation all the way down and the value to 2 to make it a lot brighter. Now you may be able to see, I'm not sure at this resolution, that we're getting a little bit of a jagged edge, and we're going to fix that by adding in a blur. Obviously we don't need it this high, and I'm actually going to put it down to 0. And I don't really know how it works, but even if it's at 0, it actually removes that jagged edge, and I think it's just because it's being processed by the blur, even if it's not actually having anything done to it. And then I will duplicate our hue and saturation, so we can change the colour of the bigger part of the laser. And I'm going to change the saturation to about 1, and then change the value to about 1.9. And maybe put the saturation up a bit to get a brighter effect. And then we're going to do something similar for our laser ball. So I'm just going to move this back, duplicate this hue and saturation, and drop it in. And you can see it's coming to visibility now. But I'm just going to reduce the saturation to about 0.8. So it has gone white because it's almost like it's been white hot. And then we're going to also blur it. So I'll duplicate this blur, and I'm just going to turn it down to 1 and 1. So we are getting a bit of a glow. And then I'll just minimize that. And then we can add in our sparks layer. So again, duplicate the render layer. In the drop down box, I'm going to change it to sparks. And then just bringing some of these nodes down a bit. we're then going to add yet another add node. So I'll drop that in, and then drop in our sparks into the bottom part. And so now we can see our sparks over the top. And very similar to that, the way we did the blurring up here, I'm going to duplicate this add node and add a blurred version on top of the original version. So again, I'm going to duplicate this blur and then plug the original one into the bottom, but I'm then going to change the factor on the add node to 0.4, and that's basically turning down the opacity of the blurred part of the image. And I'm also going to change the size of the blur to something like 0.7 and 0.7, so again a bit less of effect. And again, I'm going to duplicate this hue and saturation, but what I'm actually going to do is drop it in between both of them. And what I mean by that is both the original and the blurred version will be affected by this hue and saturation, and we're just going to bring up the colour a bit to make it look a bit more like sparks. And so 0.8 and maybe just 1 on this, so bring back a bit of the colour, and I might turn this blur up a bit actually to 0.8 and 0.8. And so now we're effectively almost done, and all we're going to do is add in that very strange object that I modelled, which was the glow mask. So duplicating our render layer, changing to glow mask, and what we're going to do, move the nodes over again, duplicate the add node and drop it in. So basically all our render layers are being added in with an add node. So then dropping in our glow mask is a bit too far. What we can actually do is select this node, shift select this node and press F, and it'll actually join them up. But we don't actually want it in the image input, we're going to use it as a factor. And I'm then going to change this bottom colour to red. But what we're going to do is add in one final blur node. And I'm going to set this to quite high numbers, so 5 and 10. And we can't quite see it, but it is actually mixing in some red. So what it's doing is using this as a mask, and instead of an image I'm actually going to plug in the alpha, so it generates a proper black and white image, and there we see the full effect. Obviously it's a bit strong, and so what I'm going to do is add a converter and a math node, change it to multiply, and then what we can do is just start playing with this, and it's basically going to reduce the effect. So if I put in 0.3, just turn it down a bit, and what it does, it just gives a bit of an extra glow. And so pretty much that's the end of the tutorial. So just to go over what we actually did, we set up our original path, and that drove the dynamic paint, and we then used the dynamic paint as a displacement. We then got this laser following the ball using a stretch 2 constraint. And really the hardest and perhaps most complicated part, it's not really that hard, but it's just getting the dynamic paint to turn on and off. And we did that by just animating the substeps and animating the influence. And all you had to remember is that when we're turning back on the dynamic paint, we're just turning the substeps on a frame after we're turning on the influence. So I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Please say in the comments if you'd like any other tutorials, or if you can think of any other text effects that you think I should do. I hope you learnt something from the tutorial. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.